Today, we're diving into the staggering human toll of one of history's most defining conflicts, the Napoleonic Wars. We always hear about the brilliant tactics and the glory, but what was the real price paid in human lives?
Well, let's just start with one single jaw-dropping number. 5 million. That's the estimate from historian David Gates for the total deaths during this period. It's a figure that's so massive, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. I mean, that's more than the entire population of many countries at the time.
But hold on, how do you even arrive at a number like 5 million? It's not like you can just pull up an old spreadsheet. The real figure is one of military history's great grim mysteries. So how do historians even begin to count the dead from 2 centuries ago?
First, we've got to understand the challenge itself. We're really talking about trying to count the uncountable, and you'll see just how incredibly difficult this task is for historians.
This quote from historian Michael Clodfelder just nails it. For most of the nation's fighting, this was way before standardized, centralized record-keeping. The paperwork of war was, chaotic, often incomplete, or just completely lost to time. So what we're left with is a lot of conjecture. It's a mix of estimates, educated guesses, and some serious historical detective work.
And is so much more complicated than just counting bodies on a battlefield. A soldier wounded by a bayonet might die weeks later from a nasty infection. Thousands were just listed as missing. Did they desert, or did their bodies end up buried in a Russian snowdrift, never to be found? And here's the kicker. The biggest killers of all were often disease, starvation, and exposure. Things like typhus would just rip through army camps and claim way more lives than combat ever did.
Okay, so now let's zoom in on the engine of these wars, France itself. What was the real price paid for Napoleon's incredible dream of glory? This chart right here reveals a pretty surprising truth about how French soldiers died. Now, you'd think, for a soldier in Napoleon's Grande Armée, the most feared fighting force in Europe, the biggest threat would be an enemy musket, right? Well, you'd be wrong. The greatest threat was actually the world around.
And this was the brutal reality of it. For every single man who fell on a famous battlefield, like Austerlitz or Waterloo, at least 2 others would eventually die from typhus or infected wounds or simply freezing to death on a retreat. The glory of the cavalry charge was rare. The misery of a wet, cold camp was constant.
And you can just see the human cost spinning out of control in the later years of the war. The numbers just keep climbing, hitting this absolutely horrifying peak in 1812 with that disastrous invasion of Russia. That year alone, 112,000 French and Allied soldiers were killed in action. And remember, that's just the combat deaths. The total number of their military dead from that one campaign was closer to 300,000. Just unbelievable.
Of course, France wasn't fighting in a vacuum. A whole continent rose up against Napoleon over the years, and the price paid by the coalition nations was equally, if not more, devastating.
I mean, just look at the sheer scale of the losses on this table. Russia bore an incredible burden, with an estimated 450,000 military dead. The various German states lost around 400,000 soldiers. And in Spain, the scene of that brutal peninsular war, over 300,000 soldiers died. And that's not even counting the hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. The toll was just immense, right across the continent.
So that brings up that question again. How can we have such a specific number for Britain, but these huge round estimates for others? Well, this slide shows exactly why. While most of the huge armies on the continent had really chaotic records, the British military, and especially the Royal Navy, were meticulous bookkeepers. And this gives us this uniquely clear and frankly terrifying window into the dangers of warfare back then.
And those detailed records? They reveal a shocking reality for the Royal Navy. For every sailor killed by an enemy cannonball, more than 10 died from disease. And get this, accidents like shipwrecks and drowning killed twice as many sailors as actual combat did. For Lord Nelson's Navy, the sea itself was a far deadlier enemy than the entire French fleet. So, what happens to a society that goes through this level of loss? Beyond the battlefields, these wars carved deep, lasting scars into the very fabric of nations, and particularly into France. All right, I want you to consider this number, 0.857. It looks so sterile, so academic, but it represents a profound human tragedy on a national scale. What could it possibly mean?
That was the ratio of men to women in France by the time the conflict was over. For every 1,000 women, there were only 857 men. The wars had literally consumed so many young men that they created a lost generation, leaving this demographic hole that would take decades to fill and would impact everything from marriage rates to birth rates.
And this cost wasn't just measured in individual grief. It completely altered the destiny of nations.
France, which had long been the most populous country in Western Europe, lost its demographic edge. This was a fundamental shift in the balance of power that would have enormous consequences, really setting the stage for the conflicts of the late 19th and early 20th century.
And this leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. The Napoleonic Wars didn't just end an era, they shaped the modern world that came after them. And it really makes you wonder, how might the entire 20th century, with its own devastating world wars, have been different if the 19th century hadn't been born from such a staggering, unimaginable loss of life?